The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Where Do I Go From Here With My Life? I'm Jim Lewis. I want to just make sure that everything's working because I've done some really stupid things and failed to turn my audio on in the past. If you can hear me and see the screen okay, would you raise your hand just so I can make sure that we're actually on the air? Okay, thank you. Great. Looks like everybody's hearing me. If you don't want to hear me, you can always mute me, I guess. Um, I want to just get started here by introducing myself. As I say, I'm Jim Lewis, and really appreciate you joining us today. And if you stick around till the end, I have a little guide on making decisions when it really matters. I've found this approach to be really, really helpful over the years, and I teach it in a couple of my classes, so I thought it might be something that would benefit you, particularly since this whole program involves making a very significant decision about your life and your career. So, um, just to let you know, I've been there and done it. I changed careers back in 1981, so I'll tell you more about that later. Um, this decision-making guide, though, has a step-by-step procedure for making important decisions in such a way that you don't forget or leave out anything, and that you also cover risks and consequences of your choices. And that's a really important factor. So hang in there. And one of the things it does, by the way, is make sure that you include all the important stakeholders in your decision making, because sometimes we forget that to our detriment. Now, in this webcast, I'm going to tell you how to determine what your major passion is, so that you can look at that in choosing a new career, new job, new position, whatever it may be. Back when I did this, it took me nearly 10 years to change careers and move into something else, and it took me a long time to figure out exactly what it was I wanted to do. And so that's one of the big steps, and I'm going to tell you how to do that in this webcast today. Incidentally, if you do have any questions along the way, it's very difficult for me to navigate this by myself. So I may miss your hand or whatever if you put it up. So if you would email me any questions you have, and I'll be glad to get back in touch with you and answer those. The email address to write to is in the webinar invitation, so that should take care of you. Just to go on into this, I was an electrical engineer originally, and designed radio equipment, and what started out being fun or heaven turned out to be a daily hell. And I started searching around for what to do, and eventually wound up going back to school to get a PhD in psychology. And I left my job in 1981, 37 years ago, on May the 1st of this year, and started teaching seminars on leadership skills for project managers and other topics on project management. And I've never looked back. It's been a good ride for me. I've helped thousands of people change careers, get better jobs. I've taught in 30 countries around the world, and um, I've been called the people engineer because I'm one of the few engineers that got that degree in psychology and deals with the people issues. So as I say, finding your passion is really important. And I was lucky because my passion has been innovation and teaching, and I've really enjoyed doing what I've done. And for the first 5 years of my career, that was fun. So I have a real strong bias that work should be fun, and then you don't really call it work. Now, it turns out everybody has a passion for something. It isn't, however, about content as much as people think it might be. It's about engaging in certain patterns of activity, and this is something that is not in most of the formal motivation theory. Most of you have probably seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the basic idea is that we're motivated to satisfy our needs. And Maslow starts down at the bottom with physical needs, biological needs. You got to have food and clothing and shelter and things of that nature. And he goes on up to the top of the pyramid and says we have a need to self-actualize. And it sounds like an army recruiting slogan: be all that we can be, fully engage ourselves. And very few people in this country seem to be truly self-actualizing, particularly when you look at Gallup surveys that say that only about 35% of the workforce is really engaged in the jobs that they have. What that tells you is there is a great deal of dissatisfaction with the jobs and even the careers that people have. And there are many reasons for that, but it's a sad state of affairs. And it says that most of our organizations are not being very effective or efficient in what they do. So if we were hiring people into jobs that contain the activity which is their passion, they would be driven to do those jobs. And if you know what your passion is, you can make a better choice of jobs and careers than people that don't know that. Now, I said it's a pattern of activity. In the previous slide, the woman was climbing a rock-faced cliff, and I get the heebie-jeebies just looking at that picture. But there are other people that jump out of perfectly good airplanes, which also gives me the heebie-jeebies. That's not something I'm likely to do very soon. However, I do have a bit of the troubleshooter in me. As an engineer, I had to do a lot of that, and so I can definitely relate to that one. And if you think about Oprah Winfrey, who's made millions and millions of dollars with her TV program and her other endeavors, a lot of what she was doing over the years was interviewing people. So she was obviously driven to get to know people, to get them talking, to find out more about them. And she did that on television and made herself a good living doing it. And if you think about it, I said it's not all about content. She was doing this in a TV situation, but she could be working for a polling company. She wouldn't be making the kind of millions that she has, but she would be interviewing people, doing what she has done all those years. She could be in journalism, going around interviewing people, gathering information for her writing. She could be an FBI agent who's interrogating people, a clinician. She could be an intake assistant for an HR department, and much more. I'm sure that you can think of other applications that would involve interviewing skills. By the way, basic problem solving requires that. You need to be asking people questions to gather information, and that is an interviewing technique. Now, here's the trick. When I went through this exercise, it took me a long time to figure out that my passion was innovation, and a secondary one was teaching, and third was helping. And I took training in neurolinguistic programming from John Grinder and Richard Bandler, who were the founders of the discipline. And John Grinder actually taught me this technique, how to find out what motivates somebody, in 15 to 30 minutes. Generally speaking, it doesn't take much longer than 30 minutes. And the way you do this, and this, by the way, is a core technique in all career-changing disciplines that I've seen. However, they don't make it nearly as easy as this. So I tell people when I'm working with them to think about a job that they had recently, preferably over the past 6 months or so that it's fresh in their minds. And it should be a job that they really, really got into. They really enjoyed it. They look forward to doing it, actually. So again, it wasn't so much work as it was fun. And they thought about the job away from work. Maybe on the way to work, they were thinking about what they were going to do that day, got very excited about it, and were totally engaged in that job. So if you want to make a note or two about this, think about that and make some notes about what you were doing in that job. And the second part of the question is, what was it about that job that really turned you on? And you need to be very specific. What part were you playing? What were you doing in the job that excited you? And you may not be able to complete all this stuff while I'm on the air here with you, but this will be the questions that you can answer after we get through. And by the way, all these handouts, I'll give you a link to download them when we get through so that you don't lose these questions. So you don't need to take a lot of notes here. But that's the first step. So I get people to tell me about the job, and I have them describe it, and I ask them things like, were you working by yourself primarily, or were you working with other people, and things of that nature. So that gives me a little bit of insight into the kind of activities they're in and the kind of situation that they like. And as you can see here, this is an architect examining a model of a home that he's designing. And if I were asking him to tell me about a job, this might be the one he might describe to me. And he'd say, I really enjoyed seeing this thing come to life, or something of that nature. Now, the second thing you have to ask, and you need 3 of these examples. So the second thing I always ask is, I tell people, you probably have some things you like to do just for fun. It could be sports, it could be hobbies, it could be making music, all kinds of things like that. But you have things you like to do away from the job. And unfortunately for a lot of people, the things they do away from the job are the things that they really get their most enjoyment from and their most payback from. It's kind of like the guy doing the water skiing here. Um, and I would ask him, what is it you really like about water skiing? What's the challenge for you? What's the excitement and the fun? Is it just staying on his feet? Is it executing tight turns? Is it going over jumps and that sort of thing? Is it speed? What is it? Why did he turn to water skiing as a fun thing to do? And by the way, sometimes people will say, well, if I had more time, I'd like to just go out and lay on the beach and just do nothing. That's not a good choice, because that's not really an activity. That's vegetating. And so I always decline to take that one as an example and ask them to instead think about things that are active, something that they really do that they enjoy. You remember that woman climbing the cliff? Have you ever stopped to think that somebody that does something like that works harder at that hobby or sport than they probably do in their physical job? So that's a great example of a true motivator, a true passion. Okay, I said you need 3 examples of things people do. So the third one is, if you have a bucket list or a wish list, something that you'd like to do sometime but you never have done it, I'd like for you to pick the one thing that would be the most exciting to you. Now, people will sometimes say, well, I'd like to start my own business, or they'll say, I'd like to travel more, and those are fine. But what I want to know when they tell me that is, what kind of business? Is it online? Is it a brick and mortar business? Is it selling? Is it creating things? What are you going to be doing in that business? Same thing with travel. Do you want to just go visit museums, or do you want to see 10 cities in 12 days or something like that? So I go into a little more depth and I say, what is it about this thing that's really exciting to you, and how will you go about it? And if you're doing this, I suggest you make some notes. In fact, it's helpful to have someone else with you to help you process all that information, but that's the approach. Okay? Now, once you have those 3 things written down or in your head, what you want to do is examine them and find the common thread that runs through them. Now, when I say the common thread, it'll be the same kind of activity. So Oprah might tell us that, well, she's just loved her television program over the years. And you say, okay, what about a bucket list? Well, I'd really love to go see Richard Branson and interview him sometime. And I'd like to go to a distant city and talk to the local people and ask them questions about how they live, and what they do for fun and relaxation and enjoyment and all that sort of thing. And so she would be expressing that interviewing pattern throughout all the things that she described. Now, I've listed just a handful of patterns. For example, I told you one of my patterns is helping people. And actually, I do that through both innovation and teaching. So uh, I express helping through those two things, but it is a pattern for me. And I said innovation, of course. Troubleshooting, I used to have to troubleshoot circuits when we built them up, and we would turn them on and they wouldn't necessarily work like they were supposed to. And you have to dig in and figure out what's wrong. I'm not so much on fixing things anymore. I used to when I was a kid, but as I've gotten older and have a little bit less time to do that sort of thing, I prefer to farm out that kind of thing. I am motivated to learn, and some of you probably are, but it's not a dominant pattern. It's not something that I want to be doing 24/7. I suspect that the woman climbing cliffs and possibly even the water skiing person may be testing themselves, um, just trying to see what they can do. Another pattern that I've found, and this you'll find in some consultants, is being an expert. It's also something you see in laboratories with scientists. They become experts on a subject, and they love to have someone come to them and say, "Oh, I'm having trouble with this. Can you help me out here? Tell me how to go about this," and so on. So that's an example. Um, I have a friend whose father was a chemist, and he worked for a large company for 20, 30 years. And they came to him one day and they said, "You've done such good work, we've decided to make you a manager." And he said, "Then I quit." And they said, "Excuse me, we told you we're going to make you a manager. What do you mean you're going to quit?" He said, "Well, I told people when I hired in that if you ever try to make me a manager, I'd quit. I don't want to be a manager. I want to be a chemist." I love that because this man knew himself really well. He knew he didn't want to be a manager. That was not his pattern of activity. Chemistry was his pattern of activity. So they said, "Well, what are we going to do to reward you?" And he said, "That's not my problem. That's your problem." And they finally figured out what to do with him. They said, "Well, how about if we make you an internal consultant? You share all this knowledge and wisdom with the rest of the people in the organization." He said, "That's great. I love that. I'm still doing chemistry and I'm being a resource for people." And he spent the rest of his life doing that. So being an expert was part of the deal for him. I noticed a friend of mine on here who is into music and has been for a long time. And so she can relate to this, I'm sure, that making music is a pattern for a lot of people. I enjoy playing music myself, by the way, and I taught guitar back in the 60s. And a couple of years ago, I'm 76 at this point, and a couple of years ago, I decided that I was going to take up fiddle because that's different than guitar. And I've read and learned that if you keep your brain active learning new things, it doesn't fall apart quite as badly as it does if you let it vegetate. So I'm enjoying learning to play the fiddle after a couple of years now. Leading other people, that's a pattern that is really important to some people. They don't want to just be a follower, they want to be a leader and have other people go where they want to go. And then people that write, that's a pattern. I know people that live to write, not write to live, but live to write. They just love to express themselves in some way. And acting, that's another pattern for some people. And Robin Williams was a wonderful example of that. He was a comic all the time, just about. I'm not sure he knew how to be serious, but those are examples of patterns. Okay. Now, as I said a while ago, travel is one of those things that I get a lot of. And the question is, what does a person do when they travel? I do know people, and I've done a lot of travel over my lifetime, and I do know people that all they do is go visit art galleries or they go visit cathedrals. And in fact, some of the tour guides will tell you that people complain that it's an ABC tour, meaning another bloody cathedral, because a lot of the tours do just go to see cathedrals and art galleries and things of that nature. We enjoy backroads touring, which means get off the beaten path and get out into the countryside and see the country, see the landscape. I like seeing the buildings, the architecture, things of that nature. But I also like to study the local culture. I really like to get to know the local people. And the best of all possible worlds for me has been when I've gotten to stay in the home of someone in Austria or England or wherever, Sweden, for a few days and just see how they live. That's really, to me, what it's all about, because I really like the people activity of it. But the trick is the pattern of activity the person engages in is what drives them to travel. And for each person, it's going to be a bit different. Now, let me give you an example of walking through this process. I teach this a lot and have taught it a lot. And not too long after I had learned how to do this, I was teaching somewhere, and I think it was up in West Virginia actually. And there was a fellow in my class who was a foreman in a coal mine. And he told his group, I put them in groups of threes, and he told his team that, he told his group that he had a team at work that had a quota to meet every week. They had to mine so much coal, and he was really driven to see to it that they did that. So he would work closely with his people to make sure that they met that quota. The second thing he said, this was his outside activity, he liked to go around the country and buy up little antiques and things like that and then try to sell them for a profit back home. And the third thing that he said he liked to do was he was a gardener and he liked to grow things. And his group was trying to figure out, well, what in the world is the common thread? And they couldn't see it. And so they called me over, and at first I couldn't see the common thread either until I asked him another question. And the question I asked him was, what is it you like to do when you're growing things? And he said, oh, I like to take several varieties of tomato plants and see which one gives me the best yield. And boy, the lights went off. It just clicked when he told me that. That was the key. He was the first and only about the second person I've interviewed over the years who was driven to do things that gave him a measurable outcome, a measurable result. The content didn't matter. As you can see, I mean, you're mining coal, you're growing things, and you're buying antiques and selling them for a profit. It wasn't the content that turned him on, it was the pattern of activity, and that's what drove him. You know, when I know somebody's pattern of activity, I try to think of things that might not motivate them, but do contain the pattern. And generally speaking, they say, oh yeah, I could see me doing that. That would be fun." Now, for example, being very precise and doing something with your hands might appeal to people to make pottery or do sculpting or wood carving or something like that. And if you said, well, you'd have to do that sort of thing as a surgeon, and they may say, well, yeah, that would involve using my hands, but I don't like blood and all that sort of thing. So the content in that case would put me off. So it's not totally not about content, but content is not nearly as important as the pattern of activity itself. Okay, so by now you should have some ideas about how this is working for you. And I have a couple of suggestions for difficulties that we run into when we do this. One of those is that you may not have a bucket list item, or if you're interviewing someone else, they may not have a bucket list item, something that they want to do someday that they haven't yet done. And if that happens, I say, well, how about telling me another thing you like to do for fun? And you know, I prefer to do that as opposed to asking for another job example, although if they don't have something else for fun, I'll go back to another job and see if I can find it with that. You need three things. You need three examples, because you can get fooled if you only have two of them. And that's the reason I go for this. Now, I had a guy protest one time that he didn't think you could figure out what motivated you at work by asking people about the fun things they do. And I said, well, I'll tell you what we'll do. First of all, I'm going to make a claim here, and then we're going to prove it. if your pattern doesn't exist in your job isn't much fun for you. And I'm convinced that's true. So what I had him do, we had some time that day, and I said, I want you to tell your group 3 fun things you do, and then I want you to tell them 3 jobs that you had that were fun for you and engaging and exciting and everything. And then see if the same pattern doesn't run through through all of them. And he said at the end, well, he was really surprised, but it did. It did. He was convinced at the end. And I've done this now for several thousand people, and I do know it works. And the fun part is the easiest one to get your information from. So if you have people that say, I don't think I've ever had a job that was fun for me, then go for things that they do away from work. By the way, sometimes it's not just a hobby. Some people like to do renovations of their home and repairs and things like that, and they love doing that. So while that's almost more like work than it is a hobby, it still contains the pattern. And so that's a good way to find this stuff out. Okay. All right. Now let me tell you a little bit about motivation and what I think is interesting about it. Here's my rock climber again. I can almost guarantee you, I don't even know who this person is. This is stock photography. But I almost guarantee you that if you knew her and you went by her desk one day and you said, hey, some of us are going to go out to such and such a location and we're going to climb such and such a rock face next Saturday. You want to go with us? She is very highly likely to say yes. Now, here would be the caveat. If she thought that that particular climb was outside her ability, she would decline perhaps. But if she thinks she can do it and it would be a challenge, she would agree. Now, it's interesting that people look at probability of success when they look at these kinds of things. And if it's too hard, they won't go. And if it's too easy, they won't go. Because if it's too easy, there's no challenge. And if it's too hard, excuse me, there's no challenge either. Now, in my case, I have vertigo really bad. You get me 2 feet off the ground and I'm dizzy. And like I said, just looking at that photograph gives me the heebie-jeebies. So I don't have that built-in pattern, and therefore you can't arouse it. This is how you know how to motivate somebody at work. You play to their motivation pattern. Unfortunately, we tend to try to use our motivation pattern to get other people excited, and that seldom works. So we need to be trying to motivate them in terms of what they engage in rather than what we do. Now, I've said I'm an innovator and a creative. And so if you ask me to help you think of some ideas, you better move over or get a big sheet of paper or a flip chart or a whiteboard or something, because that's my thing. I don't know what the pattern is for the woman climbing the cliff. I've made a possible list here. Problem solving itself is probably part of it, and testing herself is probably part of it, and possibly doing something that almost nobody else can do. And I don't mean this to be gender specific, but because I know there's quite a few women that do rock climbing, but there's probably a few more men. And she might be very tempted to prove that she can do something that a lot of her friends can't do, whether they be men or women. She might also just be proving that she can excel at something, because getting to the top of that cliff or that rock face, whatever it is certainly a feat that many of us couldn't do. Like it shows in that graphic on the slide there, we're turning the impossible into a possibility. In fiction, we talk about conflicts. We talk about man against man, or woman against woman, or woman against nature, or woman against herself in some cases. And she might have the motivation of proving that she can deal with this natural phenomenon. we'd have to get a couple more things that she does for enjoyment in order to be able to tell exactly what her pattern is. But I promise you that she has some specific pattern of activity that's involved in rock climbing. Okay, so what do you do with it once you know it? Well, of course, the idea is to find a way to do work that contains the pattern in your present career if you can. Now, this is really important to people that have invested a lot of time in their career. I'm going to give you an example of this, and I think it's a pretty interesting one. I heard about a lady who was a pianist, and she had spent her entire life playing piano, and she was quite good at it. And after a concert one evening, she had dinner with a friend, and he said, "You know, you played beautifully tonight, but I have to tell you, I didn't feel like your heart was in it." And she said, "Well, you're probably right." She said, "I'm good at it," but she said, "You know, it's not rewarding to me. It's not something I really love anymore, but it's all I know how to do at the moment." And he said, "Well, what would you prefer to be doing?" And she said, "Well, I'd really like to be a writer." And he said, "Well, then why don't you go for it?" And she did. And she became a writer. Now, I don't know what she wrote about, but I can tell you one thing that she could do that would combine writing and her career, and that would be to be a music critic or write books about music. It's like a guy wrote a book about famous composers, and he interviewed these famous composers, and many of them said they didn't write music, they took dictation because the music came to them. So that's the kind of thing that you might see coming out of a situation like that. So if you can find a way to express yourself in your current career, for example, I'm a very creative person. So when I was an engineer, I wanted to design things. But I had a friend who was not creative at all and didn't want to do that sort of thing. But that guy was the most meticulous, analytical person I have ever seen. And when you needed somebody to really collect data, make sure it was absolutely correct, do circuit analysis, that sort of thing, he was the fellow to give that job to. Related to that, I taught a class on creative thinking to a bunch of engineers once, and I have a little exercise where I tell them to generate a list of ideas for the uses of a piece of chalk. And I had a fellow that had 36 ideas for how to use a piece of chalk, and another fellow in the group only had 3. Now, initially, the guy that only had 3 things was more interesting to me because I was concerned about why he had so few. And I said, "Tell me about what you wrote down." And he said, "Well," he said, "you can write with it, and you can mark stuff, and you can draw with it." That's all he thought of. He didn't think about the fact that you could grind up a piece of chalk and put it in an emulsion or something and use it for some other purpose, or grind it up and use it for powder. And so you say, "Well, he's useless." No, he's not useless. He's the kind of guy, like I say, that I want to do detail work and analytical work probably. So if you know that you love technology, but you have an analytical mindset, then you want to go into an analytical job within that technology. On the other hand, in my case, if you put me in a detail job in engineering, I was bored to death. And I had to do a fair amount of that, and it was the part I disliked. But when you put me in the creative part, designing a product, that was what I loved. Okay, so there's one distinction also that you need to make here. Is it just your job that you're unhappy with, or is it your entire career choice? Um, I actually, if I had stayed in electrical engineering, designing radio equipment, if I could have done that without the environment being coercive and punitive and the whole bit, I'd probably still be doing it because it was my true love. I really lived and breathed designing radios from the time I was 16 years old. But the environment that I was in was coercive, and I found that if I changed jobs, I was going to have to go to places like Illinois, Schaumburg, up around Chicago. or out in Washington State or down in Florida. And I didn't really want to leave North Carolina at that time. And so it was more job dissatisfaction that drove me to do something else. And I got lucky enough to find teaching seminars as the thing that was most enjoyable for me. So uh, I did change careers completely. Although you have to understand that I've drawn on my engineering background, especially when I'm teaching groups of engineers, and that's been a very useful thing for me. So try to find some way to insert your pattern into your job if you can, and then you don't have to go through the extreme of actually changing careers. Now, let me just pause here. I'd like to know if you found this information useful so far. Would you raise your hand? Just let me get some sense of how we're doing here with satisfying people about what they're getting. Wonderful. Thank you. That's very nice to see. Um, I'll tell you, it's a very frustrating thing to be engaged in, and for that reason, it's very important that you find a useful way of approaching this, and that you look forward to the change instead of saying, "Oh my goodness, I just can't stand this." Now, if you have some questions about this, here's my email address, drjimlewis@lewisinstitute.com. Send me questions and I'll reply to them as quickly as I can, because I know that I haven't answered all your questions, but hopefully this technique is going to be of great use to you. So let's go a little further here. We've developed a workshop on career change, and if you would be willing to tell me, if you don't mind my telling you more about this, I'd like to just see how many people say yes in the chat box, because uh, I want to know just how interested you would be in this sort of thing. This will be a 2-day weekend workshop for people that really want to take control of themselves and make a change at some point in time. So if you type yes in the chat box, if you'd like to hear more about this, I would like to see it. Okay. Or I'm seeing some question marks in the question thing. So that's fine. Okay. Wonderful. So let's go a little further, and I'll tell you just a little bit about this. And I'm not going to do a used car salesman trick on you. I do want to tell you about this program. We designed a program to be produced on Saturday and Sunday because people have a hard time excusing themselves from work and losing pay and all that sort of thing. I know most of you have heard about the Myers-Briggs assessment, but what you may not know is that Myers-Briggs actually has a career report, because they do about 1 million of these a year. And what they find is that people are definitely attracted to certain careers based on their Myers-Briggs profile. So we will administer the Myers-Briggs self-scoring profile during the workshop. It takes about 20 minutes to go through it. And then we'll tell you, based on that, what kinds of careers people who have your type are drawn to. We also are going to use a book called Pathfinder, which was written by Nicholas Lohr, which is a really, really good book on career change. It's got a lot of resources in it, and in fact it's so large that we can't do all of them in a 2-day weekend, which is why we give everybody a copy of the book. When I changed careers, the book I used was exactly the title of this workshop, Where Do I Go From Here With My Life? And it was written by Crystal Bowles. And Richard Bowles is the guy that you've seen who does the book called What Color is Your Parachute? It's a job changing or job finding book. But Where Do I Go From Here With My Life was for midlife career changers. And I started working on this process when I was about 30 years old, and I finished it when I was 40. And started my job the year I turned 40, or my new career the year I turned 40. And I'm 76 now, so like I say, 37 years later, and I have enjoyed the whole thing. So as part of this workshop, though, we give you a class workbook that has the slides in it and the notes and all that sort of thing. a whole bunch of worksheets, and there will be two of us there to help you during the class. We're going to limit it to 36 people, and with two instructors in the classroom, that way we can give each person personal attention. If you go to the workshop, you'll be going through the activity pattern exercise with a group, so that if you've tried it by yourself, when you go through it with another group or with a group, this will give you either confirmation or even some insights that you didn't have initially. So that's the way that's going to work. The classroom that we're going to be using is shown here on the slide. This is a learning place over in Lake Lure, North Carolina. And we'll include lunch both days. And after the class, we'll conduct two small group coaching sessions over a period of a couple of months to make sure that you are able to actually carry out what you have learned. Those coaching sessions would normally be $100 each, so that's an additional $200 worth of value that's part of this whole deal. And we have a membership group called Living with Heart and Purpose that costs $125 a year for dues, and we'll give you a 1-year membership in that if you go through the class. We're going to also offer this eventually as an online program for people that can't go to Lake Lure, or it's either too expensive or too prohibitive, and we'll have that developed about the end of March as well. We also have a little online course that'll be available at the end of March called You Need Money But Not a Job, because some of you may decide you not only want to change careers, but you want to go into business for yourself. And starting up a business can be daunting, to say the least. So we have a little course that we teach that is on how to change jobs and start your own business. Now, I have a free app that is going to be on the both iOS and Android platforms pretty soon, called Living with Heart and Purpose. It links you to the membership site, but it also provides tips, podcasts, and other aids to help you live a more complete, fulfilling life. So if you're interested, that'll be demonstrated during the class. And we also have long-term group coaching that's available for an additional fee if the 2-month time period isn't enough for you. So here's what you get. The workshop for the weekend is going to be $9.97. A 1-year membership in the association will be $125. 2 months coaching would be $200. You Need Money But Not a Job would be $97. So you pay $9.97 and get a total value of $1,419 worth of goodies for it. So you save $422. And the membership in Living with Heart and Purpose could be priceless, really, because we're going to try to offer people who are members things that are useful to them over a period of time. So that would be the deal that you'd get. If you have a PayPal account, you can probably take 6 months to pay the fee with no interest charge. And we accept major credit cards through PayPal if you're interested. There's a hotel across the street in case you don't live nearby. I live about an hour from the site myself, but it's a beautiful place, and I love teaching there. We do guarantee the program. If you aren't satisfied at the end of the first day, we'll refund your money. You'll know by the end of the first day if you're satisfied or not, so that's why we do it that way. We only have 36 spaces available. The dates and times are on the landing page. It's going to be in April, and those dates are there. Go to tinyurl.com/WDIGFH. Where do I go from here? And it'll take you to a landing page that tells you more about the program. If you bring a second person, we give you a 10% discount for each of you, so $97 or so for each person. And you can take care of that when you register. Let me say first, thank you for attending the program. I hope you find your path, regardless of whether you attend the workshop or not. And stay in touch with me. Send me emails. I'll be glad to do some freebie coaching and counseling and that sort of thing if I can. And in order to get the guide that I told you about for making decisions, use the tinyurl.com again and add to it "you to decide." That makes it easy to remember. You two decide. And to get the notes from this presentation, this has all the slides in it with the notes on the slide. Go to tinyurl.com and WDIG notes. Where do I go? Notes. WDIG notes. So that is it. Thank you very much, folks. Have a good day, good weekend, and take care of yourselves.